just society would simply consist on the meritocratic competition up the ladder to success. That idea actually is not an alternative to inequality. If you think about it, it's a justification for inequality.
So the farm was my escape to be with animals, for them to treat me like I was nothing, to tell me that I was but one dot in the larger scheme of life.
Pakistan's history has evolved. There were very specific limitations and circumstances that in which one thing led to another. And that's how I read it or choose to read it.
We're absolutely delighted to be able to present a new season of JLF at New York in association with Asia Society, New York. We have lined up for you some wonderful ideas and themes and speakers, and I do hope that these will fire your imagination, your mind.
On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjoy K, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, we welcome you to the second session of JLF New York 2021 Virtual Festival. Acrobat, Nandana Dev Sen in conversation with Sanjoy K. Celebrated actor, screenwriter, author, and child rights activist Nandana Dev Sen takes us through a lyrical journey of poetry, memory, and identity. Her latest poetry collection, Acrobat, is a translation of her mother Nabaneeta Sen's work, an intricate thread on womanhood, intimacy, body politics, and motherhood. In conversation with Sanjoy K. Nandana discusses her inspirations and process behind this translation and her own prolific career. Introducing our speakers for today, Nandana Dev Sen is a writer, actor, and child rights activist. She has written 6 children's books, translated into more than 15 languages globally, and starred in 20 feature films from 4 continents and in numerous languages. She has represented UNICEF, Apne Aap, RAHI, and the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights to fight against child abuse and end human trafficking. Winner of the Last Girl Champion Award and multiple Best Actresses Awards, she has served on the jury of several child protection commissions, global film festivals, and international literary prizes, including the DSC Prize. Nandana is Child Protection Ambassador for Save the Children India.
Bring my phone now.
Sanjoy K, an entrepreneur of the arts, is the managing director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 33 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts, and literary festivals in 40 cities across the world, including the iconic annual Jaipur Festival, international editions of JLF, and the launch during lockdown digital series JLF Brave New World. He is a founder trustee of Salam Balak Trust, providing support services for street and working children in Delhi. Roy works closely with various industry bodies and the government on the policy issues in the cultural sector in India, and has lectured and collaborated with leading international universities. He is the co-chair of the FICCI Creative Industries Committee. This conversation will be followed by a Q&A, so please feel free to send in your questions. Do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. In these difficult times, we have struggled to bring you JLF New York 2021 without charging a registration fee. Please support as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. Simply click on Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your contribution is greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting Acrobat, Nandana Dev Sen in conversation with Sanjoy K. Sanjoy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Suraj, and Nandana, welcome. The joys of Zoom and digital, the digital world. You're sitting in New York, I'm sitting in New Delhi. Tell us, what is it like? Is it a sunny day? Is it a snowy day? What exactly is the weather there?
It's a very, very sunny day. It's beautiful. It's sparkling sunshine. It makes you realize exactly how deeply we've been affected by global warming. This is not really the weather we're supposed to have this time of year at all. But of course, we're enjoying it. And I must say, it is so lovely to feel the oxygen of JLF again, even virtually. I've missed it so much this past year. So I'm completely thrilled to be back in the fold again. So thank you, all of you, for making it happen.
And thank you for being with us. I wish this could have been live at the Asia Society in New York, our hunting ground, so to speak. But we hope to be back next year. Nonetheless, let me straight get into Acrobat. What a magnificent translation you've done of your mother's work. It's filled with love, with nuance, but most importantly, when it comes to nuance, how difficult is it to translate from a language as complex as Bengali into something as simple as English? And how was the challenge that you sort of took on to make that possible?
There are so many answers to your question, because there are various ways in which translating this book has been difficult. First of all, translating poetry is always difficult, right? We know that, and we have a large body of thinking about the rightness and wrongness of how poetry is to be translated. Do you keep the rhyme? Do you keep the rhythm? All of that. But beyond that, as you said, the structural differences between English and Bengali, which are very, very fundamental, makes a big difference. Something that you can say in 2 words may sometimes need a paragraph to be explained in English. In the case of my mom, she was brilliant with rhymes, and she loved using rhymes to make meaning, to spring surprises, to even create dissent. She used it very cleverly as an integral part of the poem, not as a kind of decorative part of it, but as an element that was creating meaning in the poem. So I made a promise to myself that every poem she wrote in rhyme and particular rhythm structure, I would keep that in the translation, which of course made it even harder.
And of course, she made up words, right, Nandana? She created words even outside of the Bengali dictionary.
Exactly, well remembered. She made up words. She was very good at neologism. So it was always a kind of a challenge to figure out the right way of translating them. And she loved puns. So she would use words which could have any number of meanings in a sentence. She was brilliant at that. It was almost a joke she was playing with herself and the reader. And then as a translator, of course, you'd have to make some very difficult choices about which way you would go with a particular word. So there were all of those. And then she loved playing with language. She liked mixing up different voices in her poetry. I mean, I can give you an example, maybe rather than talking.
I'd love you to read Right Now Forever. That would sort of place it in context.
That's a great idea. Why don't I read it in Bangla first? And
Fantastic.
Then
yeah. Let's hear the intonation of Bangla. Then you can translate it.
It's one of my favorite poems of hers. It's actually probably her most iconic and most often quoted poem.
And most excerpted poem, I think, in every publication and every Bengali magazine during Pujo.
Yes, it's true. Oh, is that happen? I missed that this time, but it doesn't surprise me, because this first line, well, you'll hear it. Ei kal chirokal. আমাকে নেবাতে পারে এত শক্তি রাখে না সময়, কখনো ভেবো না আমি সময়ের মুখ চেয়ে থাকি, সময় আমার সঙ্গে খেলে যাক যুদ্ধ যুদ্ধ খেলা, যতই কারুক শাড়ি লজ্জাবস্ত্র ঠিক থাকে বাকি, মন্ত্র বলে বেলা হয়ে যাবে সব যা ছিল অবেলা, ধর্মযুদ্ধে প্রতিবাদী চিরকাল দাঁড়ায় নির্ভয়, যেহেতু সপক্ষে তার ঈশ্বর সাধিত মহাকাল, স্বয়ং সারথি হয়ে সব গুহ ভাঙেন উত্তাল, যতই দিক না যুদ্ধ খণ্ডকাল হবে পরাজিত, এই তো জেনেছি শাস্ত্রে যতটুকু হয়েছে অধীত, অখণ্ড কালের পক্ষপাত ধন্য আমি মহাশয়, আমাকে রাঙাবে চোখ এত শক্তি রাখে না সময়. So some of you
love to know how you've done Lojjo Vostro in English.
Yeah.
Go for the English version.
So and there's so many words and phrases and rhythms here that gave me pause in this beautiful poem of hers. Okay, so right now forever. Time has not the power to extinguish me. Don't think for a moment that I wait upon time. Let time keep on playing his absurd battle game. Every time he strips me, I rise clothed without shame. With the force of prayer, of spells magic and divine, all that was untimely will turn auspicious sublime. In a just war, the rebel stands forever unafraid, for her ally is eternity, who, divinely arrayed, guides her chariot, destroying the enemy line. Thus, a divisive age will be defeated and spurned. Though it brings on great wars, it will lose every time. From all our scriptures, this is the truth I have learned. Please know that I am cherished by an undivided, infinite age. Time will never have the power to scorch me with its rage.
Beautiful. Time will never have the power to scorch me with his rage. No, I mean, you write that the kind of freedom that was most precious to her, that freedom she found from poetry. She used poetry to discover her broken voice, especially after she came back, after she, after she fell apart in a relationship with her husband. Tell us a little bit about that time and how did she use poetry to be able to build her new confidence, her new world, her new life?
Yes, that's an excellent question, because poetry was always a huge, a central part of her life. She started writing poetry when she was, she published her first poetry when she was 7. She published her first book of poems when she was 21, and she kept writing poems till the last few weeks of her life. So it was truly her life partner. But she published, when she was in England, she published quite a lot of poetry in English. That was the language that was around. She was steeped in, and it came to her naturally to do that. Once she came back to India, she made a choice not to write in English. And it was a political choice. She talked about it often, not only because her other writers of her generation were rejecting the colonizers' language as the language of their creative work. That was part of it. But in my mother's case, even more so was a fear she had that our regional languages and literatures were going to become extinct unless we held on to them and loved them and cherished them and practiced them in our literature. So that was the reason why she decided to do all of her creative writing in Bangla, although all of her academic work, as you know, she was a very formidable academic, and all of that was in English. So when she came back, the other thing about what you hit on it really perfectly, it was so fundamental to who she was. And she often wrote about the fact that she felt that if she hadn't had poetry in her life, then she would have come apart, that it was what grounded her to her life and to her emotions. It was her coping mechanism. And but she also, because that is the way she saw poetry. Poetry kind of had a sacred position in her life as an artist. She could never not tell the truth in poetry. So there was a point in her life shortly after she came back when she felt her poetry was giving her away. So she stopped writing poetry for a while because people were it was a dark time in her life. Her marriage was breaking apart. Her father had just died. She had 2 little children. She was going back to a city which at first was not quite ready how to accept this, divorced woman who, when she had left, was this glamorous young academic star. She was still very young, but she had some history, and a painful history that she brought with her this time. So all of that, the disconnect she was feeling, made her poetry very dark. And so for a short time,
Nabaneeta, hold that for a second, because set the stage for us. There she's coming back, and we know all our mashi-pishi's grandmothers, mothers, while they were formidable, when it came to being outside and articulate outside the home, they were far quieter than than the reign of terror that they wreaked within the house. Here was your mother who's come back with both of you. And she used poetry in many ways to sing about her sorrow, unheard of in its time. Do you remember how that sort of, or did it impact both of you? Did you have a sense of awareness of what was happening in her life and in the society that she had come back to?
Yes, we did, because she wrote, she was very compulsive about her poetry. She had a real need for poetry, and that was clear to us. And she, and not all, I mean, when I was talking about it earlier, it's not that she stopped writing poetry, she stopped publishing her poetry. She always wrote her poetry, but she decided to not make it public because it ended up being the deepest part of her emotions were being expressed in them. So I have to say that, yes, we understood them. And we knew, and we grew up being taken to Kobe Melons and book fairs and not being taken to the zoo or the circus. And while we complained about it at that time, I think that's when our strong connection to poetry developed, is because she took us to all of these poetry meets, which in a way I loved, although I wouldn't have admitted it at that time, right? So it was a very integral part of who she was and who we were. We would celebrate every, when there was a birthday in the family, there wouldn't be a birthday card. We would write a birthday poem. That's the way it would be. Anything, everything was celebrated through poetry in our home. And not just because of Ma, but because, both my grandparents were hugely celebrated poets. And so my mother had grown up with poetry all around her. She wrote about it very funnily often. She said that she often felt that she was both blessed and cursed by poetry because she couldn't have been anything other than a poet, she felt. But of course, it was a blessing to her because it gave her a lot of strength and the freedom that she felt was essential for a woman.
In Acrobat, one of the things that sort of came home when I was reading it for this phase was the poem Change. And I was wondering whether you have it handy and you can pull it out and read it for us.
Of course I can. Change. Everyone changes little by little, never completely, not all the way, but only a little, just enough to transform summer, monsoon, winter, night, and day.
Beautiful. And you talked about how poetry was her life, her muse, and she walked about everywhere with her Kobitar Khata, right? All over the place.
In her bag. It was always in her bag. It was under her pillow till her last days. She always had to have it with her. I mean, she had many obviously over the years, but it all happened because my Dimma had given her a Kobitar Kata, I think on one of her important birthdays, 10th birthday or something like that, 12th. And she, ever since then, she always had a Kobitar Kata with her. There's a beautiful poem that she wrote called Jotokal Kobitai, which I think gives a very good sense of what you were talking about earlier, the need to sing your sorrows through poetry. And I'd love to read that. It's very short.
Yes.
Okay. In poetry, stay alive, show yourself clearly, like the unfailing passport photo. Stay awake in every line, you, like an unquenchable thirst. Yes, you, the pain that tears my heart apart. Show yourself clearly, like a flower in full bloom. Don't hide from me, as long as I live in poetry.
Beautiful. In fact, one of the things that she writes, and you talk about it in the book, is you quote her saying, a woman writers constantly watched like a prisoner in a jail, were made to parade before the warden every morning. Her name becomes an essential part of the text that she produces, along with her whole personal life and her body. And at some point she stopped writing poetry, but her work is not just poetry, right? She wrote fiction, non-fiction, prose, but at every point of time, she always said that my foundation is first and foremost poetry.
Absolutely. That she was always going to be a poet, that whether she was writing a novel or a column or children's books, that she always wrote it with the pen of a poet. That's how she saw it, and that's how she wrote everything that she wrote. I mean, her academic work, actually, it's interesting because she focused in her academic work on poetry, on epic poetry of the world, on the Ramayana, on Valmiki's Ramayana. She focused on Chandrabhuti's Ramayana, so the first Bengali poet the first Bengali poet who was a woman. And she was also very committed. She was very passionate about translating women's poetry from all over the world and also from India, because this came from her belief that poetry was central to a woman's freedom. And by that, she didn't mean poets who were writing poetry in the cities, or academics who were inspired by their research to write poetry. She meant everyone. She meant the women who were working the fields in the villages and singing songs. She meant the women who were taking stories from the Ramayana and the Mahabharatas and converting those stories into their own stories, creating their own kind of poetry, which would allow them to sing their sorrows, as you said. And this was a big part of her overall faith in poetry, came from this. She felt that poetry was a vital necessity for women.
Where did she get her empowerment from? Was it from you, both of you as kids? Was it from her peers, the society around her? In most places, Bengali is such a steaming hothouse of politics, with everybody pointing their fingers of, where is she off to today, kind of stuff. Where did she find this empowering strength to be able to do all that she did?
I think a lot of it was just who she was, but she grew up with parents who were also extremely strong in every way, and talented and big-hearted. They gave her a lot of freedom in some ways, but she was also an only child, so they were protective of her in other ways, of course. She was identified as a superstar kind of at a young age, because she was such a brilliant student. She had her first book of poems out. She was also, and this is not known very much, she was also a wonderful painter. She was a great painter and sculptor as well. So she was sort of seen as a genius girl, and she somehow, I think her strength came from not letting any of that affect the way she saw herself. In a lot of ways, I think her strength lay in her vulnerability. There's a part of my mother that never grew up. I mean, you met her, you know what I mean. There was a kind of irrepressible love for life, and also being this openness that she had, which made her very easily hurt. There was something very sensitive and fragile about her on the one hand, but there was also this completely formidable voice of social justice and someone who believed that writing was a form of social activism, and she lived that. She walked that talk in her work, absolutely. So I think a lot of her strength came from the fact that she allowed herself to be that she retained a kind of innocence, a sort of optimism in the middle of everything, and despite all the upheavals her life had gone through, that was intact. And anybody who knows her would feel that about her. A lot of her rambunctiousness and her effusive kind of ebullience had to do with her belief in
her sheer joy of life. If she came into a room, you knew that she was a force of nature, and that was my first recollection, my first meeting with her in Kolkata. And it was immediately, the room lights up, she engages, she's with you. And when she's having a conversation, she's so engaged. And I'm going to read again something that you've written, an observation that she made, where she said, she had grown up with two eyes that were physically quite unalike. One did not know how to smile, and the other could never shed a tear. I used the smiley eye to write funny stories. The sad one looks within and writes poetry. However, even if her two eyes did look and behave as differently as she believed, there was nonetheless alike in the candor and boldness of their gaze. Tell me a little bit about how you reacted to her as a daughter. And then I would like you to read Two Eyes, Two Selves. Or you can do it the other way around. Read it and then react to my question, or react to my question and read it.
But how did I react to her? This
It's larger than life. I mean, every teenage has angst that their parents are larger than life and blah, blah, blah. But what was your sense at that point?
Well, it was, I have to say that she was a completely outstanding mother in every way, but not like any other mother I knew, right? So I wouldn't have want anything about her to be different. And she excelled as a mom, but she had nothing in common with the other excellent moms I knew, So she would go and pick fights with me in the school. I mean, I kept getting into trouble in my school. They couldn't kick me out because I was a good student. So they were hugely frustrated about it always, the fact that I was a troublemaker, but sadly, not easily I had to be kept on because of my grades. So my mother would be called in frequently, and she would always stand up for me, which was kind of amazing because, growing up in middle class Bengali culture, that doesn't happen. You go to school, the school complains to you about your child, you sort of kowtow and say, so sorry, this will not happen again. You go home and, give your kid a couple of slaps. That's sort of the way it works. And my mother always stood up for me. And that was also part of her being larger than life and doing everything her way, not following anybody's footsteps as a mother, as a poet, as a writer, as a journalist. And she was also a lot of fun. We traveled the world together when she was actually quite unwell and she was on a wheelchair, but we had so much fun. I mean, we made a list of all the places she wanted to go to and hadn't gone to yet. So we went to Egypt to see the pyramids. We went to China. We went to South Africa. And she was the most fun kind of traveling partner I've ever had, even on a wheelchair. But I have to say that sometimes we felt like we were the mothers and she was the child. I know both my sister Antara and I felt that, but that was part of her beauty as well. Part of the vulnerability that she had, the kind of deep trust that she had in everybody. It made us very protective at times, but we didn't really want her to change. That is the way she was. That's the way she continued to be, despite all the blows life had dealt her. That is who she was. She never lost her optimism. She never lost her, as you said, joy for life and her faith in people, in poetry, in having the ability to make a difference in the world. All of those things. So I think we got a lot of strength from who she was. To go back to your original question, I think she drew a lot of strength from who she was, from her parents, also from Kolkata. I have to say, I think growing up in Kolkata is such a privilege, or at least it was when I did, and also when my sister and I did, and when my mother did also. I mean, when we grew, I wouldn't have wanted to grow up anywhere else. I mean, my early childhood was spent in London, and later on, when I was still basically a child, I came to Boston. But my most formative years were in Kolkata, and so were they for my mother. And I think that made a huge difference, because everything, as you said, everything in Kolkata is political. The poetry is political. The plays are political. They were not like that anymore, but the songs, the wonderful IPTA songs were political. There was just so much excitement. The artistic production that was happening in Kolkata was intensely political, right? So that gave all of us a lot of strength and hope and a kind of spirit. We were infused by a spirit of revolution that I think came directly from the city. So a lot of strength was drawn from the city as well, I think. And then, of course, there were her travels outside. She did so well in Harvard. She was a great student. She met some of the best minds in the world at Harvard and in Cambridge. And that brought her a strength of a different kind, an academic strength. So there were various aspects of it.
I'm going to come back to the political question, but did you want to read Two Eyes, Two Selves for us?
Yes, it's called, thank you. So this one, I mean, it's so interesting that you should pick out that part in her from the introduction, because she felt very strongly that there were two sides of her. And this poem is about that, about having two very different sides of yourself. Make up your mind. Make up your mind. Who do you want? That woman or me? Within me breathe two people. Make up your mind. Who do you want? That woman or me?
Beautiful. You were talking about the politics of it and her growing up in this idiom that was politics. And yet in many ways, she translated poetry from all kinds of languages: Kannada, Kashmiri, Gujarati, Malayalam, Chinese, Russian, Japanese, Hebrew. But her act of political writing was always Bangla. That's what she felt. And I remember once speaking with Shobha Sen and Utpal Dutt, and I said, why can't you do this in Hindi? It'll get so much more, traction and blah, blah, blah. And they said, no, Bangla is the language of politics. It's the language of revolution. Tell us a little bit about how your mother looked at this as her statement in Bengali.
She felt that it was not possible for her to express dissent about what was happening around her in any language other than Bengali, because that was not only her mother tongue, but that was the language spoken around her. And I'm sure there was this sense that you talk about, that it was a language of politics in a way that other languages were not. So she didn't, so you're right. I mean, she has written some poetry in Bengali, but all her political poetry is in, she's written some poems in English, but all her political poetry is in Bengali. And I think it's connected to also what she felt at a larger level about protecting the culture, regional cultures that we have, protecting the traditions that each part of our country is known for, right? So in Bengal, we are known for revolution, we are known for poetry and art, and we are known for being able to use language to our best advantage. We are very known for that. So she felt very strongly that this was a legacy that she had inherited, and it would be doing a disservice to the mother tongue to write in any language other than Bangla. So she felt very, very strongly about that.
Did you want to read Take Back the Night at this point?
Yes, I would like to. This is actually, well, let me read it first. Right. Take back the night. Man, in the twilight, I could still hear the lark. Woman, the night was moonless, oppressively dark. man. In the flowering woods, a night fairy walked, woman. In the Sundarbans, the man-eater stalked, man. In that fragrant springtime air, woman, blood-drenched remains lay there. So this one, is a good example of a lot of issues that were important to her in her poetry. So one was using poetry as a way of finding freedom, but also using poetry as a way of representing unfreedom and of expressing dissent. Not doing that in a didactic way, not doing that by kicking and screaming, but doing it subversively, as she does in this, brutally, yet subversively, right? It's a pretty bloody poem, but it is very cleverly constructed, simply but cleverly constructed. But the other thing that, she was always fascinated by the multiplicity of perspectives. What is the truth? What is not the truth?
And it's also her ability, as you said, to inhabit different people, different points of view, different perspectives, and continue to rail against the night. And in many ways, Nandana, you yourself, you've inherited that, right? You're a fighter and you've been an activist. Tell us a little bit about how you inherited this sense that you had to make right, and your work with, say, Save the Children, for example. You're doing so much of work with them. Tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you. We grew up very conscious of the fact that we were incredibly privileged to have the life that we did. We didn't have by no means did we grow up, with a lot of affluence, but we had everything that we needed, and we had all the books in the world, and we had a happy, safe family. We had lots to eat, a lot of time to play, and somehow we didn't take any of it for granted. And for that, I am very grateful to my mother and my grandmother. I think both of them made it clear to us that we had a responsibility toward kids who did not have all that we had. So I grew up with that very much being a part of the way I looked at the world, which was one of the reasons I started working with children at a very young age. Also, I think living in Kolkata had a lot to do with it, because you saw so much inequality around you, and it was, difficult. It was easy to want to be involved with that and to want to make a difference. In fact, it would be difficult to be in denial of it, So, but she was also always super supportive. I'm really missing her now, because I've just launched this major campaign, a major program, I should say, in Bengal, which is to support the children in the most marginalized communities of Bengal who have been worst hit by COVID and by Cyclone Yas. These are kids who have lost one or both parents. They have no sustenance, they have no protection. And in Bengal, the numbers for child labor and child trafficking and child marriage have all gone up hugely in this year. So it's a real crisis. And I'm working kind of day and night on this right now, because we want to roll out the program as soon as possible. And I was just thinking, this is the sort of thing, if my mother had been around, she would have been on the phone, making calls, making it happen, calling everybody that she knew to see what support she could drum up, because that's the sort of person she was. I remember I was at the, it's very funny and very sweet, actually. I was doing, I was on the jury of a public hearing by NCPCR, the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights. And this was a jury on child protection that was happening in the Kolkata Town Hall. And it was focused on child trafficking, child labor, and also a bit on RTE, which wasn't being implemented. Anyway, so I had to start early, so we went off there. I was on the panel with Shanta Sinha and others. And then my mother shows up, and she just wanted to be in the audience to kind of be there in the middle of the conversation. I mean, such a busy person. Of course, she created a lot of distraction because many of the trafficking survivors, rather than talk about their case, wanted to go and give her a pranam and tell them how much they loved her work because she was so beloved.
But Nandana, I think one of the most amazing things about any poet or writer is the test of time, right? And look at her poem, This Child. When she wrote it, and so many decades later, even today, that poem still holds true and still shows a truth. Did you wish to share it with us? It was my favorite poem in the book.
I love that poem as well. This child. One day, this child too will die. This child, pure as milk, whom I've brought into this world with all my heart's desire and with fervent prayer. If she asks me now, on what promise have you thrust me into this strange and dazzling world? What grand celebration must I attend? I will be petrified. Choking with fear, with ignorance, I will run away to a dark cave, numb and empty. What answer will I give you?
Beautiful. I mean, it still holds true. And in so many ways, she also held a mirror, not just to society and people, but she held a mirror to truth. And her writing, in many ways, and especially her poetry, whether it's one line or two lines, it's irrelevant. It still has that essence of truth, which will stand the test of time. Nandana, I'm aware that we're running, the clock is ticking out. We have a number of questions, but maybe before I take just one question, I'm going to ask you to maybe read an excerpt from the ending of Acrobat, where you write a letter to your mother. And before you read that passage, what I wanted to ask you is, did you have any regrets of not having spoken to her or not having bared your inner soul? Because she was always bearing her world to both of you, and you lived in many ways in her world. And is this letter in some ways the sort of concluding chapter, a sort of wrapping up, laying to rest, coming to peace?
What a beautiful question. We were extremely close. So while you are absolutely right, my mother's personality was such that you were always surrounded with her personality, which was so huge, and there wasn't as much of an opportunity to bring yourself into that, which was lovely in its own way. We enjoyed that. But I actually started writing this letter to her partly because of that, partly because I felt that there were things I wanted to say to her that there was never any time to say. On her 75th birthday, when I translated a book of hers as a birthday present, as a surprise, and I wrote it as an introduction to that. And she loved it and wanted me to keep writing it. That was her idea, that I should keep writing it. So I kept adding to it. And I finished it only after she died. But she had read most of it before, which makes me happy. In terms of regrets, I think I feel like we were so open with each other with whatever we were feeling. So even when I don't even regret the fights, because we had to have the fights to get to wherever we got to after that. And they were never mean, they were just they were the fights that you can only have when you're extremely close and you love each other so madly that you can't not fight, so I don't, it's hard not to have regret. I regret not having her with me now, I just regret that.
Well, you do, because you have a poetry and you have a work read for us, because we have run out of time. Read that paragraph.
Okay. How much time do we have?
We've run out of time, so keep it as
very
short as
short.
possible, because I want us to play the little film also. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, we did have fights. I cried when you didn't understand. I begged you not to nag. I yelled at you when I was upset with someone else. I watched in panic as tears welled up in your ever adolescent eyes. But I am as sure today as I was that night in London that even if you had not been my mother, even if that most precious accident of birth had by rights been the beginning of someone else's story, even if I had met you in any of your other roles as a poet, professor, painter, friend, or a stranger on a plane, you would still be the most beautiful person I could ever have met. At the end of my book, Not Yet, which you translated into Bengali, the daughter asks, Ma, did you turn out the light? And the mother replies, yes, my dear. Now, good night. That's it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And she'll always be there for you and all our readers. Shubhadeep Majumdar, our very loyal follower, asks, is it the magnificent wit and culture of melodious Bengali language hard to tackle in English? Shubhadeep, she's already answered that pretty much in the beginning of the session. Nandana Sen, absolutely beautiful. Always wonderful having a conversation with you. For those of you listening, we would love you to pick up the book Acrobat. I promise you, you won't regret it. It will sit on your shelf. Totally, you can see the cover there. It'll sit on your shelf, and you can certainly always refer to it. It's got some wonderful poetry in it. Nandana Sen, thank you so much. Suraj Dhingra, over to you. And we had a lovely film that Nandana had put together of images with her and her mother. And I'm hoping Suraj will play it after he wraps up. Nandana, thank you. Suraj, back to you.
Thank you so much, Sanjoy. This was so much fun to finally have an adda.
I wish we could have had it in person over a glass of wine or gin and tonic.
In January.
Suraj, over to you.
Thank you, Nandana and Sanjay, for that really wonderful conversation. Nandana, as Sanjay mentioned, we hope next year we are able to receive you in person for the festival. Thank you so much for being part of JLF New York 2021 Virtual Festival. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available at our official bookstore. If you like the session, do consider supporting us through the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Sincerely value your contribution. Once again, we'd like to thank all our partners for their support. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will tune back in for the next session, The Fortune Men, Nafida Muhammad, in conversation with Abir Haq, which is at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Central Time, 1 p.m. Mountain Time, and 12:30 a.m. Indian Standard Time. We'll also play a small reading from JLF Writer Short Series by Bhashwati Ghosh. But before that, very lovely, this audiovisual montage, Nandana and Nabaneeta's life. Both of
That's
them.
right.
Hi, I'm Bhashwati Ghosh. My debut novel, Victory Colony 1950, has recently been published by Yoda Press. It's about the refugees of East Pakistan who had to flee to India in the wake of partition. I will now read a short passage from the book. Manush felt vacant. He hadn't felt this gnawing sense of hollowness since the incident involving Minoti. The death of the child at the camp, mainly a result of her battered immune system, which couldn't resist the most minor of infections, devastated him. Even a good doctor and constant medication couldn't save the little girl. As with Minoti, Manush took this as a personal failure. Unable to put his mind to reading anything, it all seemed so meaningless. Manush visited Bijoynagar more frequently to fill his evenings. He didn't always head straight to Amula's place, though he never left the colony without meeting her, but would visit other residents, many now his friends, or just spend time in Shuntu's tea stall, where he inevitably met a lot of folks. The days on which Dr. Mujumdar came to the colony, Manush dropped by to help with the clinic's operations and chat with the doctor. The doctor had had a deep impact on Manush. In moments of utter desolation, he thought of Chitra and Dr. Babu to continue on his journey as a social worker. One evening, when he went to Ganesh's house, Manush found Moina and Urmila furiously making paper bags, the same kind he had seen Urmila make at the camp. Outside, Mintu played with Hablu, while Ganesh's wife cooked the evening meal in the kitchen. Manush had become a regular at their house and often chatted with the women folk until Ganesh returned from work. They all enjoyed his company, including Urmila. "What's with these thungas, Moinadi?" Manush asked. "Oh, didn't Thakurpo tell you?" "Ganeshda, why no? Tell me, what's up?" With a shrug of her shoulder, her way of downplaying anything she did, Moina said Ganesh had recently befriended a ragtag man, himself a refugee. When he learned that Ganesh's sister-in-law had started making thungas, he offered to give old newspapers he dealt in. He would even help sell the paper bags in the Bara Bazar market, as he knew quite a few paper suppliers. "Bah, isn't that lovely news? This calls for some sweets. Wait, I'll be right back." No amount of persuasion by the women could stop Manush from heading out. He hadn't had too many reasons to celebrate in the past week and couldn't let go of one that came his way. As he scampered towards the rickshaw stand, he saw the trio of Amala, Bokul and Tara returning from work. Thank you.
A just society would simply consist on the meritocratic competition up the ladder to success. That idea actually is not an alternative to inequality. If you think about it, it's a justification for inequality.
So the farm was my escape to be with animals, for them to treat me like I was nothing, to tell me that I was but one dot in the larger scheme of life.
Pakistan's history has evolved. There were very specific limitations and circumstances that in which one thing led to another, and that's how I read it or choose to read it.
We're absolutely delighted to be able to present a new season of JLF at New York in association with Asia Society, New York. We have lined up for you some wonderful ideas and themes and speakers, and I do hope that these will fire your imagination, your mind,